to another episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. My guest today is Tom Varghese, who has a number of professional titles. He is the Division Chief of the Section of General Thoracic Surgery at the Huntsman Cancer Institute in Utah. He's also their Associate Chief Medical Quality Officer, as well as their Chief Value Officer. He has a range of leadership positions nationally, including with the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, and he is, of course, the current president of the Society of University Surgeons. He has held and continues to hold NCI funding and was responsible for the development of the Strong for Surgery program with the American College of Surgeons. But above and beyond all of this professional life, he also has much more to talk about in regard to his personal life. He's a double immigrant, if you like. He was born in India, immigrated to America, moved back to India for medical school, and then came back to America. So he knows all about being different in different societies. He has a lot to say about mentorship, basking in reflected glory, the development of integrated care, and what might be the next big thing in medicine. By the way, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And send us any comments you may have about this interview or other interviews that you'd be interested in hearing. So without further ado, let's go over and listen to Tom Varghese. I'm John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives.
Absolutely. So my life story is very unusual, and I would start by that. I was born in India when I was, and then I came to the U.S. when I was a year old. My dad had 1 year old. My dad had come over on a student visa. Remarkably, my dad was in the U.S. and my mom gave birth to me in India. So we were separate continents because my dad got his student visa about a few months before I was born. And you can remember how strict immigration rules were back then. You had, it was a lottery ticket. You got it, you went, and so my dad was here, and then I was born, and they took a year for me, to come over here to the U.S. And so I laugh and that I was probably one of the most photographed kids in the world for the first year of my life because my mom was, taking photos and mailing them to my dad. The era before the computers and the internet and all that. And so I arrived in the U.S. when I was a year old, and where my story became a little bit different than most people is I came as an immigrant to this country. And then after my sophomore year in high school at the age of 16, my family actually moved back to India. And
Yeah.
so I became an immigrant back to India. And we'll probably get into this. I mean, it's remarkable that the immigrant story of coming from the outside, trying to make a better life for yourself and trying to connect with people. Yeah, so I guess I'll start there. So, uh, I was born in India, came to the U.S. when I was one. After at the age of 16, moved back to India, and I lived there for 9 years. And I was saying that it's remarkable that immigrant journey of trying to go to a place and trying to fit in, and the pushback that sometimes you get is very similar no matter what.
Yeah.
So when I came here, one of the racist tropes I'd hear is you need to go back to your country.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when I went back to India, one of the racist tropes I would hear is you need to go back to your country.
Yeah.
And you can imagine somebody like myself going, well, where the heck do I belong? I mean, where do I go back to? And it becomes, when you see the news these days and you see the plights of refugees and you see the plights of people who get displaced as a result of war or political differences or for reasons out of their control, and see the backlash people have against them. I, you know, I can feel what they're going through. I mean, not to say that I've gone through all the hardships that they've gone
Sure.
through. I mean, some of the atrocities that they've gone through, especially in the middle of war, is remarkable. But that feeling of you want to fit in, you want to assimilate, you want to become part of a community, yet the initial pushback is you are not one of us.
Yeah,
Um,
you're an outsider, you know.
you're an outsider. And I think that there's something for each and every single one of us where you feel that you may not belong to the majority group or you're trying to fit
Sure.
in. And,
Yeah.
and it becomes especially poignant when you're trying to fit in, so to speak, in this culture we call surgery. After I went to college medical school there in India, but I always wanted to be a surgeon, and I knew that at some point I wanted to come back and wanted to train to be amongst the best. And so then immigrated back to the U.S. And after my USMLE board exams, I started, did my research for a year before the surgical residency at Northwestern. Was very fortunate. I started as a prelim, kind of a preliminary spot at Northwestern, and then they took me in and finished my training there. So I did my general surgery at Northwestern, my CT surgery at the University of Michigan, and then my first faculty position was at the University of Washington before I got recruited here to the University of Utah. So I've been kind of a nomad, academic nomad is sometimes what I call myself, kind of trying to establish myself and been around and been to many places around the world as well as here in the US and grateful for the experiences that I've had.
But you were slightly fortunate, unlike a lot of Indian graduates. I mean, when I worked in the UK for many years, and that was the landing place for many people from the
Yeah.
Indian subcontinent. And the difference between landing there and landing in the US is that many people coming from India are almost fully trained and have to redo it all. You clearly made the decision to go back almost immediately. So, you didn't
Correct. Yeah.
waste any time, if you like. And it's not wasted time, but you know what I'm getting at. But the
No,
question I
no,
was
that's a
going to
great
ask
point.
you was
It's a great point.
when you were about to go back to India, when you were 15, 16, did you consider yourself American or Indian at that time? And when you went back to India, did they consider you Indian or American?
Fantastic question. I considered myself American when I went back to India.
Mm.
And then I realized when I was there in India, I was confused for a few years. I didn't know what to identify myself as. Here, even though I considered myself American, there were very obvious ways that I wasn't. I mean, my parents were unbelievably strict, growing up, and I didn't, other than playing in the band or playing on a basketball team, I didn't really have extracurricular activities. It was just everything. The focus was studying, and that was just drilled into us. That education was the mechanism or the way forward. But I still consider myself American. And then when I went to India, yeah, even though I look like everybody around me in some ways, skin color and but they could tell the difference immediately. I mean, like even the local language, like I went
Yeah,
back to the state of Kerala, the language there is Malayalam. Even there, when I speak that language, people can tell, the accent
yeah.
kind of comes through. They can tell, by the way I speak that, I'm not from there. And so I was labeled an outsider there. And then, of course, coming back just added that level of it was just at some point. And so I think that I started realizing that, maybe the more complex your origin story is, it makes you stand out. I mean, and you're then trying to find places where I call it trying to identify cultures of belonging. Those much more open cultures where people are willing to accept diversity. And when I say diversity, I'm not talking about the way we look per se. I'm talking about diversity in background, diversity of thought, and you realize that in this world, even though people say diversity is a good thing, and we realize acknowledging there's some pushback nowadays, most people are very fearful of change. They push back on those that don't quite look like them. And I think it's a detriment, honestly, to everything. I mean, we're supposed to be the greatest immigrant nation here in the U.S., yet we push back on people who don't quite look like us or don't think like us or don't act like us. We see this in the world of surgery as well.
Yeah.
You know, that we see these sayings where, people are like, well, it's the way I've always done it. Or, and you understand where there's benefit towards standardization, but you and I both know technologies or surgical techniques that are in existence right now, 10, 15 years from now will change. We're always constantly looking to see what can benefit patients today, tomorrow, and into the future. And part of that means that you can't just be stuck in the same thing you're doing over and over again.
Yeah, I mean it's the U.S. story of racism, of course, has one unique aspect to it, which is the slavery story,
Yes.
that is different to the rest of the world, even though some countries such as the UK, were complicit in that in a slightly different way. But what is true uh, is wherever you go in the world, people don't like different. And
People don't like different.
and it's the obvious
Yeah.
the obvious way of spotting different is skin color. Um, but all you have to do is look at the Balkans, for example. That was a horrific war, between close neighbors who look identical in some respects, but are not. People don't like different, and you describe it as people don't like change. One of my favorite things that I point out to, because everybody teaches, people in management school, people don't like change. And, what I always say to people is people are fine with change as long as it's a 20% boost in their salary and a bigger office, but if it, but they don't like change because they're pretty sure it's not going to involve a bigger office and a boost in the salary, and it's going to be some way that like rains on their parade.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing that you suddenly developed when you came back from Kerala is now you're a femgem, and that's a big issue in the U.S.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you hit it right on the head. I mean, so the medical school I went to, the government medical school in the capital city of Kerala, in Trivandrum, or Thiruvananthapuram as it's known nowadays. At the time of my graduation, the med school was ranked seventh in the nation. I graduated the top 10% of my class. I was class president. I was captain of the basketball team. I was editor of the yearbook for 5 colleges. I mean, you name it. I mean, but I was just lumped into the same
Yeah.
bucket as all sorts of foreign medical grads, where the thought was we were inferior. And it's remarkable that even the most educated, most advanced people who claim that they are appreciate diversity, some of the viciousness that you face going through is eye-opening, to say the least. Kind of a persona that I put on, and now I don't know if this was more of a survivalist instinct more than anything else. There's that movie. People who know me laugh when I say this. There's this movie, The Penguins of Madagascar, where people just say, "Smile and wave, boys." That is the persona I put on. I mean, that was the armor I put on. I smiled. Outwardly, I didn't allow anybody to know that they were getting under my skin. I just put on this protective armor. It infuriated people because no matter what they did to me, I just kept smiling. But it was a defense mechanism. I mean, there's only a few people, like my wife is one of them, that really truly know what I went through going through all of this. And I may go to my grave not sharing all of this, but it is to say it wasn't easy. I mean, sometimes, I would, in a moment of, maybe weakness or something like that, I would go to my parents and say, why did we go through such a difficult pathway? But then the flip side of it is that maybe I was meant to go through that difficult pathway because I have an appreciation of what a lot of people go through. And I know
Yeah.
exactly when people say about the uphill battle or changing goalposts where they put the goalposts and then say, okay, you reach that, and then they move the goalposts even further. I know exactly what you're
Well, I
talking
think
about.
there's no doubt that people's life experiences inform the way what they mature into. Um, and some people wear it on their sleeve, and some people don't. Um, they bottle it up, if you like. I always remember when I moved from Ireland to England, there were still signs up on boarding houses that said, no blacks, dogs, or Irish.
Wow, that's
So it's
incredible.
and that wasn't as my as one of my colleagues says, well, that was a previous century. Yes, it was, but it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, right?
But
Exactly.
I'll tell you one
Yeah.
thing that you did have, which is a big advantage. Um, you may look different, but you sound American, and that's a huge strength for somebody of an Indian or Pakistani background or overseas background, because people in America, again, and it's not just America, I mean, they will, a voice that sounds like them is a huge advantage.
That's a great point, John. I do appreciate that. And the credit for that really goes to it was an early mentor in my life. It was in grade school. The principal of our grade school, Sister Noreen, I went to a Catholic school, really drilled into us the importance of handwriting, the importance of speech, the importance of communication. It was just any opportunity she got whenever she was meeting with students outside of class. She was one of these people who was always constantly pushing you to look beyond where you were at or trying to get you to see what are the goals you want to achieve in life. I was this shy kid who was very awkward and, didn't, where English wasn't my first language and was trying to appreciate that. But she kept saying, you have to look at the great speeches in history, look at the way people deliver, look at the way people talk. Uh, every single word that comes out of your mouth is measured. The intentional uses of pauses in sentences.
Yeah.
That was all a huge credit to Sister Noreen. And it was something that really came up during the pandemic. I mean, she passed away a few years ago, and I actually had the opportunity to talk to her probably a few weeks before she died, and it was very meaningful for me. It was kind of that full circle type of moment. But again, the importance of having great role models or teachers who at a formative age are trying to push you to be better than you can even imagine that you can accomplish is tremendous.
So it's an easy segue into mentors. You said you always knew you were going to be a surgeon.
Yeah.
Do you understand why that was? And talk a little bit about mentors during your surgical career.
Yeah, great question. So the idea for this came, so there is, stereotypes of Indians where most of us are either doctors or engineers. It's kind of just seems to be two of the most popular professions. In my family, we're about 98% engineers. I mean, my dad's an engineer. My wife was before she became an interior designer. My brother, you name it, armies of engineers. But I was playing basketball and I tore ligaments in my knee. And as a sophomore, and at the beginning of my sophomore year in high school, I had knee surgery, and I was just fascinated by the number of people that were involved in the care of one patient. I mean, it just blew my mind. Like I lost track of the number of people that were involved, from the people who greeted you at the door to wheeling you into surgery to the people in the recovery. Like that entire process just fascinated me. And I thought, I'd love to be part of this team. And so that's kind of where my ideas of going to medical school and some type of surgical specialty came. And so of course I went to med school thinking probably orthopedic surgery, and
Right.
then fell in love with pediatric surgery, in med school. And then when I started in my surgical training at Northwestern, realized that it was the chest, it was the anatomy, the surgery of the chest that was really fascinated me, and ultimately ended up making the decision to go into thoracic surgery. And so a lot of great mentors around from the research perspective. The person who gave me my first shot was Dr. Mike Abacassis. Dr. Abacassis is now currently the dean of the University of Arizona Medical School in Tucson. But Mike was the one who gave me the first shot of, they had an opening in the organ transplant lab and connected with Northwestern in Chicago. I had finished my boards, and I knew that I wanted to do, I wanted to learn the fundamentals of, the scientific method, hypothesis generation, designing an experiment to test that hypothesis, looking at your results, seeing if the results are reproducible, and then trying to see, do you need to change your hypothesis or not? Going back, that entire process, that methodical process. Mike was the one who really gave me that first opportunity to see that. And
I
then,
don't
of
know
course,
when these sometimes these interviews come out at different times and etc. But last week I it just shows you it's a small world. I interviewed Scott Silvestri,
that's
um,
amazing.
who is a good friend of mine. We spent the last 7, 8 years in Orlando together, and of course I interviewed him in his house as they were putting up internet in his house in Tucson, where he's just been recruited by Mike Abacassis
Yeah,
etc. So
it is a small world. I mean, I think that is indeed the small world. But the
were you
common.
one
Go
question
ahead.
about mentors? Were were you or are you, and what do you advise people intentional about finding mentors? And if you were your mentors aware that you had found them as a mentor?
Yeah, no, great question. It's a challenge because, there's that old saying that you should open yourself up to all sorts of experiences till you're about the age of 40, and then you start narrowing. And so the challenge there is that you think you know certain ways that your life is going to go, but if you don't open yourself out to diversity of experiences and diversity of mentorship styles, it becomes hard to make those decisions going forward. I think that one of the mistakes you make is if you narrow yourself too early. Maybe this is a little bit of a pushback to this. It seems like the era of early specialization, and we need to get done quick, and we need to identify what you're going to do really quickly. I'm not so sure about that. And so the mentors I gravitated to were really at the base people who genuinely wanted you to do well. They're not looking at, so I don't look at transactional relationships as mentorship. Like, oh, you work for me, and the only way I'm going to write a letter of support for you is if you do X amount of work.
Yeah, yeah.
That's more of a transactional type of thing. I look at more mentorship as it's really coming from a source of intellectual curiosity. I love, as a base, people always ask me, what are some common themes in my own career? And it's really a basic thing. I love seeing talented people perform at the highest level of their potential. I just love that. It doesn't matter what the domain is, whether it's surgery or sports or music. I just love being around talented people and seeing them reach their full potential. And so for me, mentorship is about unlocking your potential. It really comes down to is if I engage with a student or if I'm connecting with a mentor, it's like, are they putting you in situations where you can unlock your potential, pushing yourself to do better than what you may or may not be aware that you're capable of, but unlocking that potential to get to that other side.
Kind of
And
it's a surprisingly rare characteristic, the ability to bask in reflected glory.
maybe it is. And it's sad to say that
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
part of it is I get the world has a lot of problems going on. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not minimizing any of the hardships or the problems going on. But at the same time, we are living in the greatest time in the history of the world. It's like the fact that you and I right now are doing this recording for this podcast, we're not physically near each other right now. We're in
Sure.
two different places in the nation, and the technology is available, information is available at our fingertips. People are trying to grasp what the role of artificial intelligence is. But even now, I think mentorship is needed now more than ever. Just
Sure.
people just saying, hey, maybe that's a good idea. Or, I did a couple of those type of experiments years ago and it failed miserably, but maybe you may have a different result, but you should go in with your eyes wide open. These are the missteps I did in guiding. But the basking in the reflected glory, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I'm astonished that more people aren't appreciated. Somebody, I was recruiting a talented, junior faculty member a few years ago, and somebody made the comment of, Tom, what would your thoughts be if that individual won like the Nobel Prize? And I was like, well, then I'm the genius that recruited the Nobel Prize winner. I don't get it. It's like, you don't need to be jealous. I mean, it's just, reflect. Yeah, I think it's great, but you're right. It is a rarity,
Yeah.
shockingly, in this day and age of people being able to bask in the reflected glory of others.
I should reminds me, as you say, about repeating research. Always reminds me of the late great Jim Thompson. You remember, who was chair in Galveston?
Yes.
Said he used to say, repeating other people's research is like dancing with your sister. He said it's perfectly safe, but there's no future in it.
Well, so to clarify, reproducibility, I mean more of like if you have an experiment. I mean that was Mike's thing, is like you got to be able to reproduce it 3 times. But I get what you're saying about reproducing others' thoughts or ideas. I mean, really the goal is to put a spin on it. But that's
So
a great
if you
saying.
get a chance, you can look back at one of the previous interviews I did with actually a classmate of mine called Vivian Mallister. And Vivian is a very wise individual who has recently retired as a liver transplant and catastrophe surgeon in Canada. And he set up a lot of the transplant program in some of the provinces. And one thing, just was awarded the Order of Canada and stuff like that.
Wow.
Extraordinary guy. If in his early years, Vivian was a failure in terms of the traditional training model, and went backwards and forwards from Ireland to Canada and one thing or another. But he comments in that interview. He said, everybody's CV, when you look back at it, makes sense. Even if it didn't make sense at all
Yeah.
when it was happening, when you look back on it, for some reason it makes sense. The other thing I was going to say to you is, you say, we're living in the greatest time of the world. Hasn't it always been that correct to say that?
It
At the
should be.
time you say it,
Yeah, it should be. I mean, now maybe
you know.
people who were going through the depression or, the Black Plague or something like that may feel differently, but theoretically it should be. And you should have the greatest
Well,
access.
we
Yeah,
have
yeah.
versions of the plague and the Black Death going. I mean, we just went through COVID,
We went through COVID. And
So that was pretty bad, but nonetheless, that wherever you are in the world at that moment, there's stuff happening that never happened before in terms of technology, or, but the pace of change right now, is truly extraordinary. So let me ask you a
sure.
question. You've been very successful, and by the way, congratulations on the SUS presidency, and great
Thank you.
honor, and I'm sure a great privilege. I'm privileged to be an honorary member of the SUS. You probably didn't know
No,
that.
I did know that. I was going to
Yeah.
ask you afterwards to make sure that we can get you even more engaged, but congratulations.
Um, when did when did you realize, and when did other people realize that you were above average?
Great. That's an interesting question. I think it was, uh, you know, there's book smarts, street smarts, and tying it all together. I mean, book smarts, it was interesting. I mean, I always had great grades. I mean, it was just like even in the very beginning when I was in kindergarten, where at that in kindergarten, English wasn't my first language. Even then, I was somehow able to grasp concepts. And then by the time I hit first grade, I was always at the top of my class. I suddenly realized though, when with these different moves, that I was put in situations where I would have to try harder, just because of moving to a different country, moving to a different, scholastic system. When you're in a new situation, you just have to do, or be better. And so from the grades perspective, I knew that I was above average. But I think that the belief in myself came much, much later, because I think that aspect, the street smarts was, I always had a doubt of myself because I was the outsider,
Yeah.
right? And you're trying to fit in. And somehow, somewhere along the line, it was probably in the middle of my surgical residency where I just realized that if I wasn't comfortable with myself, or I believed in myself, that was the first step. It just took a while, now I'm fortunate I have a great family, an amazing spouse, I have great kids. And so I had these pillars that kind of helped reinforce that. But it was still, it had to start with myself. I had to know that, where every time people said, well, nobody's ever done that before, or, that's not possible. When I first came from India here, or coming back from India here, now again, I'm trying to pursue surgical. I had many people saying that for the foreign medical graduate to get into academic surgery, that's like mission impossible. It wasn't possible. Don't even dare to dream that. But I was like, well, I'm going to take a chance on myself. I mean, that's why I was ecstatic to get a prelim position at Northwestern, because it got my foot in the door.
Sure.
Yes, it wasn't a guaranteed position, but my foot was in the door. And so it was like, I'm going to work on it. And fortunately, I had, there were professors there and academic faculty and mentors there that realized what my potential was, and they believed in me. And so whether that was luck, grit, hard work, combination of all those, probably, but it all started with the belief in myself. I had to believe in myself first.
Well, plus, I mean, it's just a reality that there's a difference between getting a prelim at Northwestern and getting a prelim in somewhere in the boonies, and no offense to Nebraska or wherever, I mean,
Sure.
you know,
But that was an intentional choice by me
for
when I was
sure,
doing
but
yeah, it was, but you make a great point. And this is not to disparage any other programs and
no,
everything. It's just
exactly.
that
Yeah.
your path, which is already hard, is going to be even more harder if you're coming from programs that aren't as well connected. At least at what my goals were. Like I knew that I wanted to do some sort of specialty training. Fell in love with thoracic surgery. So then I knew it was CT surgery, and specifically with the focus on thoracic surgery. I knew I wanted to be in
Yeah.
academic surgery. Like once you realize what your goals and your aims and your missions are, then you have to look at the situation at hand and say, okay, what are the paths forward?
You just
Um,
needed, like a lot of people, you needed that lucky break. Um,
yes,
and
absolutely.
you get
I'm
into the argument of, well, you make
No,
a
no,
decision too carefully, but it's, uh,
I'm the first person to admit I have had breaks in my life that others have
sure.
not
Yeah.
had. But some of it is making your own luck, but there's no question about that is to do that. Now, things that have probably benefited me is, yes, I do have a belief in my own abilities and my own self. I mean, if I don't have a certain skill set, I will go out and make sure I get that skill set. The current leadership positions I have right now, like one of the, in addition to being chief of thoracic surgery, I'm in charge of quality for the Huntsman
Yeah.
Cancer Hospital right now. That last skill set, I went and did an a master's in
Yeah.
business administration a couple of years ago. That wasn't easy either. But I was like sitting there going, I'm looking at budgets, I'm trying to put strategy for the organization. I want operational skill sets. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just talking it, that I really knew that. And so I made the fundamental decision to say, I'm going to go and get that skill set. Now, others may have said, why bother? You don't need to do
Well,
that.
so you've just like a witness on the witness stand, you've just opened the door for me to ask the question.
Go
Um,
for it.
um, what are you going to be in 10 years? This
Great
is
question. Yeah,
this
great
is
question.
this is these are the small acorns that lead to a CEO, you
Yeah,
know.
no, great question. I'll be honest with people out there. I mean, I'm going through a little bit of soul searching right now of, um, would I love to be a chair of surgery one day? Yes. But I'm not sure, a little bit of doubt has crept in because I'm actually enjoying a lot of the hospital level leadership roles that I have had
Yeah.
recently. And so you can imagine that that's two different pathways, right? That, becoming a chair and going through the traditional school of medicine pathway is one pathway versus the other pathway of becoming, a hospital leader or CEO or a leader of a health system is a different pathway. And there are other universities where there's a merger of both. But I'm having a lot of fun right now, John. Honestly, I mean, I love my job. Absolutely love my job, and right now I have the best of all worlds. I have a role in the C-suite. I'm helping teams yeah, as part of being the leadership of the thoracic surgery program, helping to train the next generation, doing academic research. I mean, like I'm having a blast right now. So.
Well, that sounds like a definite maybe. Um,
Hedged a little bit, but I think part of it is, is being able to capitalize with the opportunities at hand.
sure.
It is just to see where the opportunities arise, and then if it's a great one, go for it.
So a good friend of mine will be known to you, a guy called Tom Watson. Uh,
Tom, yes, know Tom very well. Yes.
so Tom and I left Rochester at the same time, and he took a job in DC that had a significant leadership role to it, regional administrative role. And as you know, he's no longer there. He moved on from that. And as he was moving on from that, he said to me something which I've done quite a few leadership things in the past, but he articulated something that I think is interesting. He said, I became a name in esophageal surgery. I was well known, USC background, and
Yeah.
I could hold my own in any company having a conversation about that side of my life. He said, but now I find myself sitting in a room with people on the administrative side who have no knowledge, appreciation, understanding, or interest in the fact that I may or may not have been a player in the world of esophageal surgery, for example, or thoracic surgery. He said, I'm sitting beside, young administrators who are following an administrative pathway, and I'm in their world.
Yeah.
That and it's really quite challenging to, how do I convince people that that I'm worthy in their world as I was in my previous world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, Tom's a great guy. And I mean, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, obviously I know Tom well from multiple circles, including he's a fellow thoracic surgeon, but he articulates it well. I mean, I think it's one of the downsides of this, what we call the corporatization of healthcare right now,
Yeah.
right? And I think healthcare has always been a business. Don't get me wrong. It's more upfront and pervasive now than it was in years past. And part of it is the margins are getting very, very tight. And a lot of the times, the decisions organizations are making may or may not be mission aligned anymore. And I think that we're all struggling to figure out how to do that. And the young, talented, the business administrative folks, they're very cutthroat in their approach. They're looking at the bottom line for everything. And
Yeah.
many of us over the years who may or may not have been paying attention to the bottom line as astutely are realizing that those old ways are not going to cut it anymore. And I think that it's just a culture shock, and I think it's just immersion in different cultures, and part of it you start asking yourselves, um, you know, I'll give you an example of one struggle academic medical centers have right now. the patient who doesn't have resources, who has had so many disadvantages in their life, shouldn't they deserve the best healthcare out there? And the answer, of course, for all of us should be yes. But if you look at the disparities that are emerging in terms of access and variability in outcomes, and just having a conversation with a specialist, those disparities are widening. And academic medical centers who are struggling to try to these safety net hospitals, for example, it's sobering. Hahnemann Hospital going under should have been a wake-up call for every single one of us. And if it's not a wake-up call, it should be. I mean, it's just that was a tremendous institution with phenomenal leaders and physicians and healthcare teams that provided great work for their communities that just
Yeah.
went on. And I was shocked that more of an outcry wasn't had from people. Like, that can happen anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
if all the people who think that they're in a great situation right now, it doesn't take much for your financial situation and your landscape to change.
Too
And I
big.
think it's something that we need to think about. Like,
Yeah.
there's fundamental questions. Should for-profit industries exist in healthcare? I don't know what the right answer is, but maybe
Well,
you and
I
I are gonna
mean,
open up Pandora's box, but
there,
there's a lot of fundamental questions to ask.
there is the classic phrase that says, not for profit is a tax designation, not a business model.
Correct.
Uh,
Correct. But the reason, if you go back to the origin of not-for-profit, the reason they're supposed to be not-for-profit is politicians way back when realized that there are going to be certain parts of their business that are going to lose money
yeah,
because of helping the poor,
yeah,
helping those who don't have resources. They need to do that. That's why they got the not-for-profit designation in the first place. And the biggest travesty that's happening right now is there are not-for-profit organizations not doing their job, serving the community. I mean, if they don't want to do that, if they want to go through the lens of we're not going to help certain segments of the population, great. Give up your not-for-profit status. That should be an easy decision to make.
yeah.
But
And I'll say this, no names, no pactoral, no names, but
I know we're trying to keep it above board. Go for it, John.
my observation as a humble surgeon practicing is that the there's a and you described it as a widening disparity. It's my observation that the conglomerate systems that have shifted from a private model to what people have called a private-demic model, more of a group practice, an employed model, versus a traditional academic model that perhaps has become a system.
Yeah.
But if you don't have resources, it's going to be much easier to get care in the academic medical center than those um, corporate systems that have developed, because their bottom line is their bottom line. And as in, they behave um, to all intents and purposes as for-profit organizations, even though they have not-for-profit designation. Now, obviously, that's a generalization, and but I think, I've worked in institutions where it was not a problem dealing with indigent populations without healthcare resources, and I've worked in institutions where it was not easy.
Right.
And
I mean, I think
both
that
of them are classified as not for profit.
not for profit. Yeah. I think that the tricky part comes to, I mean, just fundamentals is what is the area that you serve? Who are the communities you serve? I think that's where you start the conversation first. Which are like, we need to change the conversations towards, like, even in surgery, and we're starting to see this because the surgery intervention should not be independent of the long-term trajectory or care of the patient, correct? I mean, so there's this concept called integrated care.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is when you look at the domains of quality, There's traditional 6 domains everybody talks about. The traditional things is the intervention effective? Is it safe? Is it patient-centered? Is it timely? Is it efficient? Is it equitable? These are the 6 everybody talks about. But there's a 7th domain, and that 7th domain is integrated, meaning that if I perform a surgery on you, do you recover enough that you are able to live a productive, healthy life, that it goes on, it's integrated longitudinally with all of your care. So that's a fundamental thing that people don't pay enough attention to. And I think that we're starting to change that conversation in the world of surgery by looking at longer outcomes. It's not just 30-day outcomes anymore. It's 60, 90, a year, 2 years, 5 years. And we're starting to shift that conversation there. But it's just highlighting that care should not be siloed. Care should not be independent of each other. And especially when more and more diseases are becoming chronic diseases. Traditionally right now we have chronic diseases of things like high blood pressure or diabetes. HIV right now is slowly, in yours and my lifetime, has become from a death sentence to a chronic problem. Cancer, that's what we're leaning towards. Cancer right now. I'm a cancer surgeon. Cancer now is slowly becoming one where we're getting, with the more and more advances, where it's becoming a chronic disease. And if it becomes truly a chronic disease, this is even more important about integrated care. And when you're thinking about integrated care, it's very, very important that you need to make sure you're doing the best care for the community, the patients at large. You have to build that system. We're not designed that way right now. Right now, healthcare is still that, transactional, fee for service, independent. Oh, I did my surgery. After 30 days, it becomes somebody else's problem. That's where we're reimbursed for right now. But that's what's got to change. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for all of us as we start thinking about the changing paradigms and what it is that patients need, but it's got to be longitudinal care. It's integrated care, and surgery has to have this, hallelujah moment where we start realizing that we need to start designing interventions that way. And so then once you start thinking about that way, then you can start answering thoughtful questions. The most recent social media conversation that was happening this weekend was a very thoughtful conversation that, Justin Dimick, who's the chair of surgery at Michigan, for example, started, and he talked about it. He was like, hey, we have all these GLP-1 agonists right now, and the drugs are available, but what about the role of bariatric surgery? And then somebody actually thoughtfully came up and said, hey, look at what happened with peptic ulcer disease and all the surgeries, right? I mean, there were textbooks, you and I, when we were in training, there were chapters dedicated to different types of peptic ulcer surgical interventions.
Yeah.
And now all of that the surgery is still there, but it's the extreme case that maybe medications is the best way of doing it. And maybe that's what's going to happen with weight loss. We don't know. But surgeons need to be involved in doing the research and trying to figure that out.
It's for sure. I interviewed Neil Mortensen recently, who in his early career worked with a guy called Professor David Johnson, who was in the world, seemed to be 3 people that could do a highly selective vagotomy. There's one in Denmark,
And he was one of them.
one in America, and one in the UK, etc. And David's academic career was based on highly selective vagotomy. And as Neil points out, he was working for him at the time when Tagamet was introduced. And as he said, literally overnight, his practice disappeared. And he became a pouch surgeon because it just disappeared. And now, of course, following the work in Australia, the disease disappeared. Never mind
disease
the
disappeared.
operation.
Even antibiotic treatment for ulcer disease. Remember that paper was rejected.
Sure.
So many different organizations, and people were ridiculing them. And now look, it's like, of course, for H. pylori, it's an infection. Of course, you give it antibiotics for that. It just
well, I think ultimately getting the Nobel Prize is the
is the way to
the final middle finger. Sure.
No, it's amazing.
So tell me this. Everybody says, oh, I don't really care how I'm remembered in that one thing or another. But how do you think you'll be remembered, or how would you like to be remembered? They're not necessarily the same thing.
Great question. I think that whether you want to call it luck, whether you want to call it circumstances, I have gotten my foot in the doors of many places that traditionally people like myself weren't allowed into. And I'd like to be remembered for two things. I'd like to be able to say is not only did he get his foot in the door, he really widened it, allowed other people to come, people who are even way better than myself. I always say that when sometimes people say, "Well, Tom, you're the first foreign grad who ever graduated from the from Northwestern's surgical training program," or I was also the first thoracic tract CT surgery fellow at the University of Michigan. Whatever the first I've had,
Yeah.
I always tell people, but have you seen the second, third, fourth people that follow behind me? They're way better than me. I mean, that's a pride point for myself, is to say that I'm hoping the people who may have benefited from me opening a door are way better than myself, because that's what allows our field to thrive or get better, is when talented people from all over the world are allowed to come into the house of surgery. Our field just gets better.
And
Um,
the second thing?
and the second thing is, you know, I hope that I was a good person to be around. I mean, I just think that um, I try to learn from my circumstances. I try to approach things with a sense of humor, but I'm hoping that people who I've interacted with never left saying, "Man, that was a terrible time." I just hope they had a good time when they were around me, and I think that my spin on the world is, yes, there's a lot of problems, but I also want to appreciate the fact that we have a lot of opportunities, and
Yeah.
I think that all of us together, working together, building that better world for all of us, I think that's a good thing, and so I'm hoping
So
that's.
yeah, no, very good words, and echoed by many of the people that I've interviewed actually. That all of the number of papers or the grant income, it really doesn't matter. The other stuff is much more fundamental.
It's much more fundamental and everything. I mean, I think that on my social media profile, I always introduce myself as a dad, a husband, a thoracic surgeon, and in that order. I think that I'm fiercely proud of my two kids. I have an amazing wife, a great family, but I've had a lot of great students and trainees, and I've learned a lot from them. Just again, it's kind of the touchstone in my life is I love to be around talented people and learn from
You're a pretty high profile. I mean, it's all variable, or relative, I should say, in terms of, social media profile. I mean, you've, I don't know, you've 35, 40,000 Twitter followers, which, for someone like me is a big number, but, my son is a football commentator and he has like 100 and something that, so it's all
magnitudes
relative,
above. Yeah, exactly.
But did you set out to do that deliberately or intentionally, or was it
Great
just,
question. No, the answer is no. So, one of the programs we built was Strong for Surgery, which is
yes,
now an
yes,
official quality program of the American College of Surgeons.
yeah,
And so that was building on optimizing patient health before surgery. And so we had started as a public awareness campaign in Washington State when I was on faculty at the University of Washington. And so I engaged on Twitter in 2013. And my intention at that time was really, I was just trying to learn from people around me. That was the reason. The follower count, and I remember first couple of years. I mean, yeah, I would put out tweets or put out things. Nobody paid any attention, but it was just kind of this. It's the
yeah,
principle of compound interest, right? The more you do it, and you add one follower, then you add two, and so now 11 years later, you have what the social media presence is, but it's still intentionally. I actually call myself more of a curator than anything else. I just look to see. I have enough followers now that they're always posting amazing things, and so I'll look to see where directions of conversations are going, or I'll assimilate things together. In this presidential year that I have for the SUS, one thing we just did. So every Saturday under the hashtag SUS Pres Saturday, what we do is what I'm doing right now is I'm just showing glimpses of lives of the past SUS presidents. And it's
Yeah.
actually been a lot of fun
Yeah.
because you
Mhm.
you realize, like, this past Saturday we just posted on Dr. David Sabeson at
Yeah.
Duke,
Yeah.
and for all his accolades, what his biggest pride point was is the people he his teaching, the
Yeah.
people he trained. That was his biggest pride. It wasn't the 1,000+ peer-reviewed publications he had. It wasn't the fact that he had 35 years worth of continuous NIH funding. Like, all those things
Yeah.
pale in
Yeah.
comparison to the people he taught. Like,
Yeah. I
that was
would
what his pride point was.
you'll hear that from Scott Silvestri. He was a
Yeah.
Duke boy, and had was on both sides of Sabison's tongue. So in the last few minutes, just a few really quite serious questions for you now. So, what is your favorite food?
Great question. Uh, Pizza. And this is where
Pizza?
I always start. I mean, it's Thai. I love food of all types. I love
There
Indian
has
food.
to
I
be
love all
pizza is always followed by the second question. You know,
Which type? Yeah,
yeah.
that's where I get in trouble. It's like, uh, I still, in the U.S., I still consider my hometown Chicago, so I love a deep dish Chicago pizza. But I
Okay.
also love New York slice. Don't get me
No,
wrong.
no, no. It's
But this
just
is where I always get into problems.
you can't choose. What's your favorite movie?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a tough one to answer because I actually, so I clarify this by saying I love going to movie theaters and watching movies, and the reason why this is a throwback to the years I lived in India. So in India, when a popular movie comes out, the most popular time of the show is on opening day. They call it the second show, which is at night, the 9:30 p.m. At night show. And it's tough because there's throngs of people coming through. And my friends, since I was bigger than most people, they would use me as the battering ram in front to go and sit and everything. But I love movies of all type. I mean, and so I think it changes. Of course, I love movies like Gladiator and Apollo 13. But I loved, watching not the old Top Gun, the new one, Maverick, in the movie theaters, just because I love watching the action sequences. Loved all the Marvel movies, but it's tough. It's hard for me to pinpoint one because I just love the experience of going to
Okay.
the movie theater and
All right.
watching it on the big screen.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs, definitely. I've had both in my life, but I'm a dog person.
Um, can you predict for me the next biggest thing in 10 years?
Wow. Here, I'll narrow it. I think a lot of academic medical centers are going to either go under or get merged as part of bigger systems. Um, that may be a bad thing for us
Yeah.
because I think competition is good. If you think about something as simple as your cell phone, when they broke up, Ma Bell, that's the reason why cell phones exist right now. Because if they hadn't done that, if the government hadn't broken that up, there wouldn't be the competition and all that we see right now.
I always,
With
when
these
people
mergers,
say,
I don't know if that's a good thing or not. So.
when people say competition is good, I always say to people, there speaks somebody who doesn't have any competition.
No, we always have fierce competition.
Yeah.
And like in my environment, we have great organizations in our
Sure.
backyard right now. I learn from them. Sometimes they'll do something and I'm like, wow, that's a great thing. We should do that too. Uh,
Friday night, you are having a dinner party and you have two spare seats. You can invite anyone from history.
oh, geez. Anybody from history. I
Anyone.
would say one is Nelson Mandela.
Hmm.
And the other one is very similar, is Mahatma Gandhi. And the reason why the two of them is the question I would ask both of them is, when you were facing all that adversity and all that oppression against you, how did you keep your temperament cool? Or what did you do to think of the bigger picture? Because remember, they're celebrated now, but in their lifetime, neither of them were
Yeah.
celebrated.
I
There
just
was
you know, the irony of inviting Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela to a dinner party and a fight breaking out.
political difference, but those would be the two off the top of my head. But that's just figures it out. But again, there are a lot of surgical heroes that were flawed human beings.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you and I both know, like, you'll hear about their accolades about the advanced of surgical technique, and then you learn later on that maybe they weren't the best human beings to be around,
Now
and
that
and you struggle with that, a little bit.
the human entity is a flawed model, I mean, it just is.
That's
Um,
amazing.
what is your favorite book?
Oh, I have a lot of books. Yeah,
You're only allowed one.
Um, eh, one of my favorites is Drive by Daniel Pink. And he talks about how human beings, the motivation for them to go forward is based on three principles. It's autonomy. Are they doing something that the more and more they do, they get better at it? Sorry, autonomy is about the principle of having independence and chasing something. Mastery is the more and more you do it, the get you better you get at it. And then purpose. Are you doing something bigger than yourselves? Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And he says that most of the ways that you motivate people is by trying to identify those three areas. There's no question for me. That's one of the reasons why I went into the field of surgery, because surgery is by definition, you have all those three things. I mean, you have autonomy in terms of the patients you choose to operate on or don't, decision making, mastery. The more and more you do it, you do get better at it,
Yeah.
especially if you're doing it at a high volume. And purpose, we're of course doing it on something bigger than ourselves, doing it for our patients. And so, but yeah, Drive has been one of my favorites over the years.
Last question. Rest of your life in 5 words.
Wow, that's a tough one. Doing better, 2 words.
Okay.
I think that whatever I choose to do or am fortunate to be able to be part of, do we leave that in a better place than we started? Doing better, I think, would be the
Well,
words
they're
I would
good
use.
words to finish on, Tom. Thank you so much for spending time talking to me
No,
today.
John, this has been a very fascinating interview. Thank you for the opportunity, and looking forward to the final version of this podcast when it releases. Thank you.